Well, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank you first and foremost for being here. This event is so incredibly important, so thank you. I'm very excited about our panel. We have some amazing scholars ready to speak. Before we get to them, I just want to go over a little bit how this is going to run. This first speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we will have a 5-minute Q&A. The second speaker will speak, and then we will have a little bit longer time to chat after that. So first, I would love to introduce Dr. Eleanor Careless. She's a research fellow for the Business of Women's Words, Purpose and Profit in Feminist Publishing. Leverhulme funded project based at the University of Sussex and partnered with the British Library. She specializes in 20th century poetry, the history of the prison and the feminist avant-garde. Recent publications include Anna Mendelsohn, Jennifer Moxley, and the Transnational Carceral Poetics of the 1990s in College Literature, published in 2020. Art Made Me Thin, Work in the Poetry and Prison Writing of Anna Mendelsohn in Poetry and Work, published in 2019. And a prize-winning essay, Muriel Rukeyser and the Security of the Imagination, Poetry and Propaganda in 1940s America in Modernist Cultures, published in 2019. She's a co-editor with Vicky Sparrow of a special issue on Anna Mendelsohn for the Journal of British and Irish Innovative Poetry. And I give you, with all pleasure, Dr. Eleanor Careless.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. I'm just going to try and share my screen and get my PowerPoint up. Please let me know if it's not working. Okay. I'm just going to start that. Okay. So my paper is called Usable Elegies. It's about Muriel Rukeyser's third elegy and the legacy of the Spanish Civil War. I'm Eleanor Careless. Okay, so I'm going to move to my first slide. In 1971, accused of obstructing the passage of senators during a lie-in anti-Vietnam War protest outside the Senate, along with other luminaries of the era, including Noam Chomsky, John Voight, and Mrs. Leonard Bernstein, Rukeyser stood trial and was handed a short-term prison sentence. Notes from her archive, which I was fascinated to find, revealed that during the trial, she listed several of her poems as part of her official defense for her actions, calling them up as if they were witnesses. And you can see part of Rukeyser's defense statement here. And she writes, "I am a poet, and in my poetry have expressed my objections to the illegal acts of my government in Vietnam and my understanding of the Nuremberg obligation, which I followed on June 27th. Some of the poems expressing these beliefs are Delta poems, Bringing, and 10 elegies." As this statement makes clear, Rukeyser's anti-war activism in the 70s was strongly influenced by the legacy of World War II. The Nuremberg obligation to which she refers was developed by the United Nations in 1945 to codify the principles underlying the post-war Nuremberg trials of the 1940s. Nuremberg obligation is defined as an individual responsibility and a legal obligation to take action to halt the commission of war crimes. In her court statement, Rukeyser explains that the horrors of Vietnam impelled her to stand against the crimes being committed by her government, according to the decision at Nuremberg. Now, among the poems which express these beliefs to individual responsibility are Rukeyser's 10 elegies. And this is where I want to start. Rukeyser described the elegies in a footnote in her 1951 selected poems as 10 poems whose development is based on, I'm quoting, growing connections of images and process over a period of 10 years. So the elegies are framed here as organic, evolving forms. And this framing affirms that World War II, of course, was not the only conflict to shape Rukeyser's activism in the 70s. As we know, Rukeyser was in Spain when civil war broke out in 1936. And as Rowena Kennedy Epstein's scholarship has demonstrated, she would continue to write about that war and its aftermath for over 40 years, creating, I quote, a radical and interconnected 20th century textual history. The war in Spain shadows the early elegies. In the first elegy, Spain stands for the sum of the years. In the fourth elegy, a child cries Aviación in reference to Franco's Air Force, and Madrid and Barcelona appear as cities of contagion. There is famine, there are refugees, but it is in the third elegy, I think, that Spain surfaces most prominently, in the form of communists in Catalonia and the general's nephew shouting "Planes for Spain." I want to ask, what does the shadow of Spain mean for the elegy's invocations of loss and hope? For Clive Bush, Spain represents a generic site of failure in the elegies. I want to build on this insight to argue that Rekaiser, in fact, mobilizes this site of failure and left-wing melancholy into political promise, both on and off the page. In addition to Spain and Vietnam, there is another formative historical context to the elegies. They were published in clusters throughout the 1940s, a time when poetry in Rekaiser's conception was in decline due to a fearful Cold War climate and the emergence of McCarthyism. This political context is the key to the title of the third elegy, The Fear of Form, which echoes the title of Rekaiser's 1941 essay, The Fear of Poetry, an essay which articulates the connection between fear political and fear poetic. As if to defy such a fear, the third elegy is extremely formally experimental with a strong modernist streak. Against a tyranny of method, which is the opening line of the third elegy, this elegy seeks to make it new with both new methods and new combinations, which you can see there on the right-hand side of my slide. Not only does the third elegy advocate making it new and breaking it apart in order to make it new, but also combining or a fusing, as we see in this fifth stanza. New combinations set out materials now, combine them again. This is a central theme of the third elegy, and one which segues into the fourth. It's urging to make room for fusion, to, in the words of the first line of the elegy, fuse it straight, to overcome division and weld together. This elegy is, I think, the most meta-poetic of all the elegies, and perhaps also the most ekphrastic. It's full of connected images. It is thick with references to visual media, both primitive and fine art, from a penis or a finger dipped in red pigment and asylum art to Picasso and Gaudi's Surrealist Church, which Rekaiser describes as a spiral in Catalonia. This is a recurring motif, which our attention has already been drawn to in the talks over the last 2 days, the way that Rekaiser picks up the same motif, the same image, and deploys it again and again. Rekaiser describes Barcelona with a specific reference to Gaudi as a city of two contrasting spirals in an article for Life and Letters in 1936 as well. And here's a beautiful image of what Gaudi's cathedral would have looked like when Rekaiser was in Barcelona in the 1930s. Rekaiser's treatment of visual media in the third elegy is surrealistic and darkly playful. Going back to the third elegy in the second stanza, you can see the trio of blackness, obscurity, and bravado, classified as three colors, a Dali-esque outrageous smile, which seals the museums, and a car full of communists who irreverently blow 1, 2, 3 on the horn before the surrealist house. These dense and ludic references are bracketed by declarative and imperative statements and rhetorical questions, such as hammer up your abstractions, a breaking, what do you want, a variation on I want, and in almost the only use of the first person in this elegy, the usable present starts my calendar. This assertion, which inaugurates a new method, a new system for organizing time, with the proviso that it be usable, appears midway through the elegy and marks a breakpoint, a way forward, away from the haunting ghosts of tarnished countesses, varnished cemetery life, and even varnished Picassos, the corrupt elite, the monumentalized dead, and the venerated artist. With characteristic irreverence, the fear of form even reimagines Michelangelo's creation of Adam and the fusion of Adam's finger with God. I've got an image, a detail of the creation of Adam here. I think you can see the sphere that Ricaiza describes at the focal joint, Michelangelo's own rendering of organic form. The poem then urges sacrilegiously the contact of those points, those two fingers, and declares, all you adjacent and contagious points make room for fusion, full you monuments. So throughout this elegy, the call to fuse is followed by a break in the poetic line, a caesura or rupturing white space. And it is marked by this movement between fusing and pulling apart, a hybrid breaking and remaking, a call to and enaction of highly experimental poetic form. But what does fusion and the falling of monuments have to do with the legacy of Spain? If we think of the monumental obsession of post-war Spain, I'm thinking here of edifices such as Franco's Valley of the Fallen, as a continuation and expression of the politics of fascism, and resistance to such monumentalization may in turn be read as a form of anti-fascism and enables us as readers to reconsider the political and poetic commitments and afterlives of that acutely troubled era, especially at a time when statues are falling across the world. Non-fascist works of art also have a part to play in the monumental history of Spain. Picasso's Guernica being perhaps the most famous example, an image that articulated the horrors of total war so powerfully that it has become synonymous with a sense of outrage and condemnation. In 1958, the art critic Roland Penrose described the far-reaching legacy of Guernica as a lasting protest against war, which remained, I quote, valid even after the cause for which it had been painted had met with defeat. In the third elegy, Ricaiza invokes a shape-shifting Picasso, I quote, like an ass, Picasso like a dragon, Picasso like a romantic movement. Contradictory analogies that call up, for me, Guernica's chaotic figures of horse, bull, woman, light bulb, and its outpouring of silent horror. Penrose's analysis of Guernica might be applied to Ricaiza's elegiac invocations of the Spanish Civil War. I would in fact go further than Penrose and suggest that Ricaiza's invocations of Spain do not merely remain valid, but catalyze political failure, animated by the communists leaning on their horn, or the Francoist figure calling for military reinforcements, into new methods, new combinations, and new vision. In so doing, Ricaiza's elegy stands apart from a melancholic canon of Spanish Civil War poetry, and from the very form of elegy itself, which is traditionally a lament rather than a call to action or to new method. There is a poetic tradition in which the Spain of the Civil War period becomes a cipher for a collective mood of grief or melancholy. The Irish poet Louis Nice wrote in 1909 that Spain would soon denote our grief, our aspirations. And in what is perhaps the best known English poem of the war, W.H. Auden memorializes Republican Spain as the suicide pact, the romantic death, and finds that history to the defeated may say alas, but cannot help nor pardon. As Kennedy Epstein observes, Auden's poem is as formally traditional as the historical narrative it presents, where Ricaiza's elegy is as formally experimental, I would say, as its radical vision. the correspondence between Spain and grief or martyrdom made by MacNeice and Auden is representative of the dominant melancholic key of Anglo-Spanish Civil War poetry. Against this tradition, Rakaisa's irreverent, ludic third elegy dismantles the pure high monument, fuses active remembrance with new process, a new calendar, and reimagines the very function of the elegy as an expression of political commitment to the usable present, or, as she puts it in the 10th elegy, every elegy is the present. When in 1972, Rakaisa uses her elegies to express her commitment to the principles enshrined in the Nuremberg obligation, she does not win the case for her defense, but she does harness her elegies and the legacy of Spain to the continual cause of resistance. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. We will now have a 5-minute Q&A for anyone who has questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat.
Can I just say that this was marvelous, but before I have a Q&A, a Q question, I will have to think about it for longer, but this was really, thank you so much. The questions will come.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
We have a raised hand from Meg.
Hi, yeah, I could get us started with questions. Thank you so much for your paper, Eleanor. I really, one of the things I liked was your attention to the word fusion in the elegies. I think that has always struck me. And I guess one of the questions I've had with the elegies, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about this in relation to Spain. So I'm kind of curious, like, what do you think the speed of fusion is? It's kind of a question about temporality or even just like tempo. I'm wondering, how does these issues of grief and of elegy, as you're talking about them, you know, and I really liked how you brought up the Sagrada Familia. That's such a beautiful building, but of course it's been famously delayed in its building, and it's taken a really long time, partly because of the damage that was done during the Spanish Civil War. And yeah, so that's just, you know, kind of the different maybe speeds that are registered there. The one is very slow, and then fusion seems to connote something more abrupt, or at least in my mind. So that's not it's a very messy question, but I would just love to hear more.
I think it's really interesting. It's a really interesting way of thinking about fusion. I mean, it's something I've sort of been wrestling with, I guess, rather than sort of feeling I know exactly, or it's not a question of exactly perhaps, but I've been trying to think through this phrase, fuse it straight, which Rakaisa uses and comes back to a number of times. I'm particularly perplexed actually by the idea of straightness there, what straightness is doing. But in response to your question, I mean, I guess you're absolutely right that there's so much sort of temporal delay in and around the subjects of this elegy, whether it is the building of Gaudi's cathedral, whether it is the sort of slow progress towards reconciliation in post-Francoist Spain, which of course is happening after the elegies and even after Rakaisa's trial in 71. And of course, fusion perhaps implies something in some ways instantaneous, or at least there are moments in the third elegy where it feels like Rakaisa is almost calling for some sort of forge in which to make this fusion, which feels very immediate. But of course, there's the very trans-historical nature of her writing, especially about Spain, in fact, makes, I think that this idea of fusing, of bringing all these different threads together and pulling some sort of vision, some sort of usable present out of them, in fact, means there's a much slower movement. So perhaps we're back to Rakaisa's doubleness here. You both have a sense of immediacy, but at the same time, of course, this great sense of layers of history.
Thank you, Eleanor. We have a question in the Q&A from Laura. It says, I've been thinking a lot about American poets writing about Spain after the war. Rukeyser is definitely taking more experimental risks than Aaron Kramer, Philip Levine, Barbara Guest. I wonder if this is more of her own political commitments coming into view and wanting the poem to do more work beyond the Spanish Civil War rather than a more direct lament for Spain. What do you think?
Could you repeat the very last bit of that question? So rather than just a lament for Spain?
Do you think this is more of her own political commitments coming into view and wanting the poem to do more work beyond the Spanish Civil War rather than a more direct lament for Spain?
I mean, I think, I guess that it's both, because although I have centered Spain in this reading, it's certainly not only Spain, which is the subject of this elegy, of all the elegies. I guess the question is about, to what degree there's a sort of, the question of aesthetics is at play, and whether that is most prominent in an elegy like this, where you do have this sense of real experimentation. I don't think the two are divisible, really. I think that it is sort of Rukeyser's way of recognizing the legacy of Spain, of responding to the legacy of Spain, is bound up with the formal innovation in her poetic work. I think of all the poets I could think of, I trust Rukeyser to find a way to fuse, if you like, poetic innovation with political commitment. And I had another thought related to that, which was, I was thinking of other, so there's some wonderful poems by Nancy Cunard about Spain as well, which are also really fascinating to me, and I've written about some of them, and they're also extremely experimental in form, very radical, and almost sort of futuristic in their layout on the page. So I do think there is a sort of an avant-garde of poets writing about Spain, as well as those more canonical figures who you mentioned.
And I think I saw one more hand. Rowena?
Can I be the hand? Thank you, Eleanor. It's so nice to finally meet you. That was lovely and really interesting. And I was just really wanted you to talk a little bit more about your lovely extension of refuting Auden and the idea of every elegy is the present and what she's doing with that. I thought that was such a perfect note to end on, and then to think of the long space of the Spanish Civil War. Maybe in all of our thinking, in some ways, I still think Spain is the moment that we have not gotten over for what was possible, and then how the rise of fascism was allowed to spread unmitigated from that moment. But I just wanted you, I don't know, I wanted to hear your thinking more on that, if you are willing, if we have a minute left to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's brilliant about that idea of elegies as the present is, I think what I want to do is perhaps give it a gendered reading. There's an essay by Sylvia Townsend Warner about the quality of the woman writer being a quality of immediacy. That's because the woman writer has to get in through the pantry window, which lends her writing a sort of an immediacy. And I think there are lots of things to be said about that idea. But I think that, Warner was another one of the activist women writers who were in Spain. She's of Rukeyser's generation. I think there's something to that. There's something to this, this idea that if you have writers such as Auden who are kind of resigned to this idea of history as being a pattern of defeat, and their poetry kind of enshrining and monumentalizing that defeatism, you then have a very different group of poets and writers. I think like Cunard, like Rukeyser, like Townsend Warner, and also later, I would even argue that there's a wonderful British poet called Anna Mendelssohn, who was far too young to be around during the Spanish Civil War, but writes about it in a very trans-historical way, and really brings this quality of immediacy and presentness to their writing. And I think it's that real sort of political, what's the word? That political impulse, which comes from the recognition of everything that Spain represented, what it stood for, and the consequences, the global consequences of what happened in Spain, and trying to recognize that and to pull it into the present, which of course is the best work, I guess, that an elegy can do.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. That was fascinating, and I look forward to speaking with you more. Our next speaker, Trudy Witonsky, teaches first-year English and American literature at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater and has published on Adrienne Rich, Muriel Rukeyser, multiculturalism, and composition. And it is my pleasure to introduce Trudy.
Well, thank you. And I feel like the paper goes a little long, so I'll just try to maybe go through the Muriel Rukeyser part. But I was thinking about Muriel Rukeyser and maybe some of the connections with anti-racist work in Danez Smith's work. So see what you think. That sort of beginning thoughts here in some ways. So I began this paper searching for answers from Muriel Rukeyser and spoken word poet Danez Smith. Under our former president, but even longer than that, we've been besieged by almost unmitigatedly bad news where our government or social attitudes are devastating and literally resulting in death. In his 2015 book, Disposable Futures, The Seduction of Violence in the Age of Spectacle, Henry Giroux considers the way in which neoliberalism has laid siege to public spheres that support non-market values and led to a normalization of dystopian narratives about climate change, for instance, and the way whole groups of people can be deemed, quote unquote, disposable. He states, quote, under neoliberalism, imagining a better future is limited entirely to imagining simply how to survive, unquote. So feeling outnumbered, outmessaged by those appointed to power, I wanted to know how to hold my mind, what kind of perspective to take, how to see what's really happening and preserve or conjure enough hope and a sense of agency against forces that feel overwhelming. Both poets articulate the tragedies and they don't give us a way to transcend the losses. The dead are still dead and the living are still traumatized. But what struck me about both of them is that each still affirms the possibility of imagining, of creating. In his book, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, Robin Kelley argues that the map to a new world is in the imagination, unquote. And he charts how various Black radical movements and writers develop new knowledge, questions, and strategies to reconceptualize their own capability. Kelley makes the case that surrealism in particular, as an artistic and revolutionary movement, quote, where the energies of love and imagination are understood as powerful social forces, unquote, can take us to another place or envision a different way of seeing. If we think of surrealism as this movement that aimed to access the unconscious, understood as both individual and collective through dreams and techniques like automatic writing, which might induce shamanistic or trance-like states in order to free the imagination and desire in order to transform society. Kelley notes that among many surrealists, there was a sense that non-Western cultures often oppressed valued human qualities and imagination and practices that more regularly allowed access to these levels of consciousness. In defining surrealism, he draws on a statement from the Chicago Surrealist Group from 1976, which asserts that, quote, the basic aim of surrealism is to lessen and eventually to completely resolve the contradiction between everyday life and our wildest dreams. By definition, subversive, surrealist thought and action are intended not only to discredit and destroy the forces of repression, but also to emancipate desire and supply it with new poetic weapons. Beginning with the abolition of imaginative slavery, it advances to the creation of a free society in which everyone will be a poet, a society in which everyone will be able to develop his or her potentialities fully and freely, unquote. So both Rukeyser in Elegies and Danez Smith in Don't Call Us Dead from 2017 employ surrealist strategies to write themselves out of demoralizing historical circumstances. And they, to use Muriel's words, quote, resist beyond suffering, travel beyond dream, knowing the promise of the night flowering worlds. So we've been talking about Rukeyser's situation as she was writing the elegies. And so I'll just mostly talk about Smith for a second. Smith's preferred pronoun is they, contends with the decades-long pattern of police and others killing young Black men. Despite the mobilization of massive marches and protests by Black writers, artists, activists, politicians, and community members, the tragedies persist. Smith was brought up in a religious household, but identified as queer and non-binary, which complicated relationships and influence, as did contracting HIV. Their work makes clear the fear, the exhaustion, the toll, both physical and psychic, in trying to survive in our country as a Black person. But out of that struggle, Smith's use of imagination creates room for possible alternatives, even spaces for joy. And key to that is that, like Rukeyser, Smith insists that we need to, quote, bring our whole selves to a piece we are creating, to not attempt to segregate any parts of our being from any other, unquote. And their work might suggest or complicate aspects of Rukeyser's vision. At one level, the surreal, as both writers employ it, reflects their experiences of daily living in a contradictory, compartmentalized capitalist world. But it also provides a means to liberate the imagination by drawing on dream, the unconscious, and traditions buried, wasted, and lost. So both writers walk on the edge of what is and what can be to generate a hopeful kind of imagination for the reader. The new world comes among the old one's harms, Muriel wrote. For her, those harms included the social order of positivism, rationalism, and reason, repressing the complexity of emotional experience and dream, and becoming captive to a fascistic imagination. Quote, the children, she says, grow in authority and become Molitor, Dr. Passive, and powerful Dr. Falcon. But if this wasteland was, as Rukeyser says, the war imagination made, then surrealism's emphases enabled an alternative kind of imagination to recognize the tragic experiences and to experiment, to sever and reconnect, to reimagine relationships. So Picasso like an ass, Picasso like a dragon, Picasso like a romantic movement. The moment is arrangement. So we know a little of Rukeyser's familiarity with surrealism. She did translations for an introduction that André Breton wrote for a book of quote unquote primitive paintings. And she also translated an introduction written by Tristan Tzara for a 1938 art exhibit of Judson Briggs' work, which was to aid the North American Committee to Aid Spanish Democracy. And Life of Poetry, I think folks are maybe familiar with the way she talks about how our country of immigrants has succumbed to an assimilationist kind of repressive code. So I'll maybe skip a little bit there. So even before the fascism of the 1930s, our tendency to compartmentalize aspects of our psyches and our cultural lives, to separate out art from daily life, was part of the problem. I think a museumification of culture, and I think Catherine Gander writes about this in her article on Rukeyser and pragmatism. So I was thinking about that third elegy as well, where the poet denounces tyranny of method and writes about, in contrast, the car full of communists blowing 1, 2, 3 on the horn before the surrealist house, a spiral in Catalonia. So that's an image, I think, of the ways in which art is more organic and part of a revolutionary sensibility. But in Elegy, surrealism, I think, also provides this kind of macabre imagery to register the horror of the effects of fascism on people's emotional and social lives. In the following lines, I think one imagines the parades of Germany or Italy, quote, rich streets full of empty coats parading as half-faced, half-sexed, the living dead arrive, passing a lip, a breast, half of a hand, gaudy sadistic streets dishonest avenues where every face has bargained for its eyes, unquote. So that longing for something to counter the sort of militaristic, restricted range of human being pervades the poem and is associated especially with love, and I think Rukeyser's relationship with Otto Bosch, also with children's play as perhaps a means of reminding us of what we're humanly capable of, and with the ghost dancing of the Klamath. In Elegy 6, the speaker calls, "My love, reach me again," this memory of a time of great feeling and cherishing that was connected to collective action. And I think if we can draw maybe from the autobiographical elements of Savage Coast, the way she figures Otto Bosch there, this joyful sense of aligned purpose and vocation. So, so that importance of love, and in Elegy 6, she talks about that loss and carrying that loss, carrying counter agony into the world. Dream singing, river madness, the tragic fugal love of a theme balancing another theme. She says, this is the war imagination made. It must be strong enough to make a peace. And so in addition to children's play, what I wanted to also just look at a little bit is the strategy perhaps of a way of reckoning with loss and carrying love into a future, the way that might be done. And as Robin Kelley explains, quote, "An acceptance of the marvelous existed in the lives of Blacks and non-Western peoples before Breton, before Rimbaud, before Lautréamont, in music, dance, speech, the plastic arts, and above all, philosophy. We are, after all, talking about cultures that valued imagination, improvisation, and verbal agility, from storytelling, preaching, and singing to toasting and the dozens," unquote. So in Elegy 7, Rukeyser is focusing on the Klamath as a way of maybe understanding how a whole culture deals with losing a war, diminished power, betrayal, death, and the loss of love, where you see, I think, Spain and the Ghost Dance overlapping. And she's drawing on Phileo Nash's work, an anthropologist who had married her good friend Edith Rosenfels, and then he had later advised President Truman on desegregation of the armed forces. And her use of the material suggests that she values it for providing the image of a collective response that draws on the unconscious, dream, the spiritual, and the physical in a way that mainstream didn't, that there's this synthesizing or maybe fusing here. In Life of Poetry, she says, in the Indian culture, quote, "The songs had religious presence. We have the spectacle of a culture that values its poetry, driven into captivity and repression by a power culture that sets no store on this art," unquote. She says, quote, "In their relationship to our culture, which had denied them and starved them at the root, they tell us that they still live and that we may rise to full life at any time," unquote. And she notes their emphasis on rhythm, public spirit, joy of life, and says that they excel in art propensities and in truthfulness. So all these things that surrealists were interested in, that she felt like these repressive codes were repressing. As an image of a kind of art that provides a sustenance for daily living that's not relegated to the museum where everyone practices it, she finds here processes to acknowledge the betrayal and the defeat. The Klamath were fighting for survival, resisting being relegated to a reservation, and there were several different groups, and they were joining part of this larger movement of ghost dancing. So in the poem, I think we see the emphasis on the dead staying dead. You know, word comes, they are dancing to bring the dead back, but they did not come back. You know, and ways in which this tragedy is not mitigated, that we remember the lava beds, the ground that opened, the red wounds opening. And some of that's the historical, geographical context, and some of it seems, you know, very resonant. But over time, collectively and individually, still dreaming and singing the songs of the dreams, the songs evolve and new visions, not just of the dead, come. Quote, "In the summer, dreaming was common to all of us, the drumbeat hope, the bursting heart of wish, music to bind us as the vision streamed at midnight, brightened to belief," unquote. And I think the elegy maybe testifies to this greater sense of and trust in human capability if we can access all of our human resources, the physical, the spiritual, the unconscious, that will always be inadequate, but will also always be, she says, quote, in wheels, in whirlwind, in a storm of power, alive again and over every land, the thunderbird, the fiery embryo umbilical, always to failure, and form developing American out of conflict. And then a kind of revelation in this poem, quote, we are the world together. Here is the place in hope on time's hillside, where hope in one's image wavers for the last time and moves out of one's body up the slope. That place in love where oneself as the body of love moves out of the old lifetime toward the beloved, singing. And I'll just stop there. So I won't get to Smith, but we can talk about Smith.
Thank you so much, Trudy. That is fantastic. And side note, that is one of my favorite elegies. So we will open with any questions, and we have a little bit more time than we did before. So Rowena?
Yeah, I was just wondering if you can talk a little bit more about Brookhiser's Indigenous influences. I mean, partly just because I've been really deep into the Boaz, but not really. The Boaz is almost ancillary to how she begins to theorize the currents of Indigenous influences on modernism and the avant-garde. And I think she starts to do that a lot. And it's really, I was wondering if you could kind of extrapolate a little bit.
You know, I feel like I'm still really learning about that. In some ways, I was sort of reading Phileo Nash's work a little bit, and Edith Rosenfels, and I don't know, Bill, maybe you know more about this too, but that Edith Rosenfels was a friend of hers from college, and Edith left after 1 year, and I think went to the University of Chicago, but became an anthropologist herself, and so anyway, I think it's some of Nash's work, and I don't know that, I mean, at this point, in some ways, I'm not sure that, I mean, I think this is maybe one of the limitations. I'm not sure how in depth at this point Rukeyser's knowledge is, that there's to some degree some idealizing or some, she's not fully immersed in the culture, I don't think at this point, but I think that the image of other processes that combine the physical and the social, that this way of kind of thinking about what art does, the process, is really something that sparks the sense of possibility for her, that lets her, it may be back to our morning conversation, that lets her go beyond the ways of thinking about what we already have. And then I think as you bring in more writers of color, though, you can see some limitations. Like I think Daneza Smith's work really emphasizes the imagination as well, which is really catalyzing. And it's really inspiring. But I was sort of thinking about a poem that they do called Dinosaurs in the Hood, and this idea, like, and their work has kind of got like these imaginative, and then other places more definitely surrealistic kinds of images, but this idea of making a movie, a kid's movie, but there's so much, it can't be this, it shouldn't be this, I don't want to see, as much like clearing space as much as before that they can really say, I want, I mean, they're saying I want, but there's also a lot of, it can't be this. And that's really, you see the restrictions on Black imagination, what it is to just the desire to have some space to imagine free of cultural narratives.
Bill, you had your hand up. Do you have something to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to weigh in. My mother clearly was not immune to mythologizing or idealizing. And so I don't know how much at that point she had gotten into Native American culture, certainly to some extent, but I wanted to pass on to you a couple of stories from one summer that she spent in northern Vancouver Island when I was a toddler. This was living among the people of the First Nation of northern Vancouver Island that we used to refer to as the Kwakiutl. And a couple of stories that she liked to tell about that time. One was they said, we're glad to see you. You've brought a kid with you. We have some understanding of who you are. Most of the white people who come here alone, and we can't tell who they are. But they also said, you guys come here in the summertime. In the wintertime, there are very few white people and certainly no white scientists. What we do then in the wintertime is make up lies to tell the white scientists the next summer. So she absolutely appreciated that. The other thing that they told her was, you guys and we are not that different in terms of our traditions, but you're trying to suppress our traditions. An example is the Canadian government has outlawed the practice of potlatches, but you don't outlaw Christmas. What's the difference between the gift-giving traditions of the two? That's it.
That's great. Thank you, Bill. Thank you for weighing in on that. I don't think anyone has obviously the most firsthand experience. So thank you so much. We have a question from Craig Trudy. He says, as I listen to your thoughts on transformation and the way Muriel opens a tradition that is present in Smith, I also thought of Alfredo Vea, Joey Harjo, Sherman Alexie, and of course, Adrienne Rich. What I'm wondering, thinking of your talk on the dream singing, is how much this feels like jazz to me. Wondering if you have thoughts on that.
I know I'd love to hear more, Craig, for your thoughts on that too, because I think that idea of like innovating something new out of traditions, which is both individual and collective, is really interesting here. And I think that Kelly really mentions that with jazz, like the surreal, like this image of the future that is kind of being innovated at the same time. And with Smith and Vea, a sense of supposing things that maybe haven't happened, that are imaginative, but that imagination gives us a kind of energy to think about what's possible in the future, or what's possible, what to do. I mean, to kind of connect the way in which the imagination could kind of connect to revolution, to doing something, and that you need that space of hopefulness.
Trudy, I was interested, students pointed me to the dream singing elegy and the Kenyon Review, and there is an author's note by Rukeyser, and maybe this is where you also found the reference to the anthropologist, but that's where she compares clearly, or she makes the link between the dream singing and what's happening in the camps. And how she says the dreams will outrange the horrors. And there's I think a little bit of almost sounds like the dreams outrage the horrors, but they also outrange it. I'm not sure in 44 how much she knew of what exactly was happening in the camps, but it's that link that has interested me, particularly when it comes to elegy and joy. And my thinking has been to wonder, and as you know, to what extent for Rukeyser the birth of Israel was one of the imaginative legacies of the Spanish Civil War. To what extent she thought of that event as, which is why the elegy is so joyful, because you know, I've been wondering how it can be that joyful even in 1948, because the Second World War had ended, but the Cold War was beginning, and you know, there was, in terms of the hopefulness. But so anyhow, this is some thinking I had about that, and that's something that I think would be interesting to pursue. Not so much a question as a statement.
Thank you. We have just a few more minutes. Are there any other questions?
I keep wanting to know a little, I know if I can ask Rowena a question. Because I keep wanting to know more about her work with Boaz, because it seems to me anthropology at this time, like, was a place where, you know, you still do have the master's language in many ways with kind of conceptualizations of people of race, but yet anthropology is like where, and Boaz is, you know, breaking that apart, you know, and I guess I just wondered
Oh yeah, I mean,
why she got involved.
yeah, I think she was highly, I mean, she took the first class was with, in 1933 at Columbia, she took a class with Ruth Brunzell, who was Boaz's student and colleague. So by the early, and he was on the committee for Negro student issues, and that's why she went down to Scottsboro originally. So it was a committee with all these New York radicals and anthropologists. And so I do think that, and Catherine talks about this too, it informed her work, and it gave her a language for disidentifying with white supremacy and for beginning her anti-racist work. And then I just wrote a whole chapter on this, and it kind of actually blew my mind about her post-birth poetry and writing, and that she became uniquely interested in the transformation mass, and which was also where Boaz developed his theoretical, and this was in Vancouver Island, with the Kwakwaka'wakw is how they pronounce it now, I believe. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. And that she was using the image of the mass as this kind of new effective space to talk about the body, to talk about birth, and to do all of these kind of, to give herself a language for the bodily, basically, and for kind of mythic self-narration. So I think the anthropological stuff is like super important. The fact that she worked on Boaz for like decades, and that, you know, it didn't materialize for lots of reasons. But I think what she learned from it was what you were talking about a little bit, which is the idea that the indigenous populations gave back to the Western anthropologists, as the scholar Isaiah Wilner talks about, a language of kind of experimentation, of self-revelation, and that was taken kind of into the West, thereby transforming it, and that she actually adopts some of that. And it's really amazing. So it really changes the directionality of thinking about the period, and who's influencing who. So if you want to read his essay, Isaiah Wilner's essay is called Transformation Mass, about where Boaz basically got his information. And it's like a brilliant rethinking about the role of the anthropologists and their relation with their subjects, quote unquote. I think Rukeyser worked on that too a lot. So I don't know, yeah, I was interested. I didn't even know about the Edith Rosenthal either. So now I'm gonna email you and ask you what you know, because I feel like, as always, there's all these threads I wanna like find out more about.
Bill, did you want to weigh in on that?
Well, I actually wanted to give you a couple of footnotes to things that were raised earlier. One was about Phileo Nash and the question of the master's language. Subsequent to that time in the late 40s, he went into elective politics. He was, I believe, lieutenant governor of Wisconsin for a while, and subsequent to that was head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in DC. And, you know, that's kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, people were happy that finally somebody who knew something about Native American culture was in charge of the BIA. He was the first anthropologist to take that position. On the other hand, this was somebody speaking the master's language, knowing Native American culture as an outsider. And my impression is that he was happy about the things he was able to do, but certainly realized that there was far more that should have been done to reform the BIA and the way Native Americans were treated during the Johnson administration. And so there you have it. And to answer a point that Elizabeth made, in 44, my mother probably knew a whole lot more about what was happening in the concentration camps than most Americans did. However, this had been fairly substantively reported at the time, and one book I have from her library was called The Black Book of Polish Jewry, which documents a whole lot of what the atrocities were, and this is published during the war.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that that footnote, especially, you know, I know in our class, it came up, we had wondered how early maybe your mother had known about the camps and, you know, where that played into certain things. So I really appreciate that.
One of her associates who I made reference to yesterday, an artist who had fought in Spain and subsequently fought for the U.S. Army during World War II. He was an Austrian anti-Nazi. He had been in one of the first camps set up right outside of Berlin in the early 30s, very soon after the Nazis took over. And so he had certainly told her not about what was going on in the extermination camps, but she had secondhand information from a direct witness of what had gone on in early concentration camps.
Do you mind repeating the name of the book that you're referring to?
Yes, it's The Black Book of Polish Jewry, and I will send you a full citation after this session.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Bill. We have a couple more minutes. Eric, I believe you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, this was partly to answer, tack on to what Rowena had said about Trudy's question about Rukeyser and Boas. You know, part of how she was drawn to him was the ways in which he sort of laid a groundwork for what had been called from Columbia since the 19-teens, cultural pluralism. And so one of the interesting things in her archive, it's just one of those weird things. I don't know how it got there or how exactly, if it was just part of her researches, but is this kind of amazing comic book, which features, do you remember this, Rowena? Which features like a story on Franz Boas.
A hero.
Yeah, as a hero, and it's a hero of cultural pluralism. It's I think it's like from 68. I can't remember the exact date. I have pictures of it somewhere, but I'd have to dig them up. But that was one of her primary attractions, I think, to him as a figure.
She was also commissioned to write the biography. It was her one authorized biography, right? That's the long-running joke. So by Boas's son, so they corresponded a lot, and she was pretty intimately involved with the family, it seemed like.
And if I may channel my colleague Marty Schickman, who is not here, he says, and Franz Boas was a Jew.
Yes, but I think that's part of it, right? And Bill can probably speak to that, was that he was a German Jew, right? And part of a secular tradition of anti-authoritarianism.
Dennis?
Yeah. Does anybody know? I know that Zora Neale Hurston also studied with Franz Boas, and part of her anthropological finds in Haiti and stuff were guided in that context. Did Muriel meet Zora Neale at that time, or do we know about any relationship that might have started there around those times?
Yeah, they have a letter in the archive, actually. So, yeah.
Yeah, I have a colleague at Rice who believes that they may have been sleeping together. And to like invoke something Bill had said years ago, you know, Muriel got around. So they had probably an intimate relationship with one another, at least a friendship.
And I guess my understanding is that's also how Alice Walker went to go to just rediscover Hurston, was via Rukeyser's. But I mean, maybe Louise, do you have thoughts on this?
And
Or talk about it?
I do know that Muriel Rukeyser's last poem was based on that relationship with Zora Neale Hurston and Alice Walker. It was sort of, it seemed that it was part of a healing process. I don't really know much about it, but there was some dispute or struggle, and then I don't know, this was part of Muriel bringing it all back together. Bill, do you know anything about this? He's not on.
Yeah, it's a complex story, which probably would deserve an entire separate session. But to put it really briefly, I think it's echoed in a lot of artist mentor sagas and fables throughout history. My mother and Alice Walker were very close to each other at Sarah Lawrence. My mother and Monica McCall, my mother's partner, assisted Alice in getting her career, her published career started. There was a falling out, certain amount of bitter feeling on the part of Monica and hence my mother, in terms of, I think probably at some time in the 60s, they would have described their feelings as in terms of a betrayal. Then things calmed down. But I think that this is almost an archetypical story in terms of a lot of artists.
Could I just add an observation? That Muriel Rukeyser Day at Sarah Lawrence was extraordinary because of the two presentations that Muriel gave, and that Alice was there to celebrate, of course, with whole Grace was there, and there was something exalted about that moment in history, and the emotion and the feeling that was in that moment. And I remember what happened with Muriel, and I also remember when Alice spoke, and it was the first time she gave her lecture about essentially why it was okay to have one child. You didn't have to have a second child or a third child. And I remember Alice had a cold that day. And when she walked up to give her lecture, she actually stumbled on the stairs going up. She had a cold, I guess she was, and gave the most extraordinary speech. And it was just sort of like the same thing that happened with Muriel that day. There was something about the emotional thing that between Alice and Muriel that tied that day together. It's just a memory I share. But Bill, I appreciate hearing the Zora Neale Hurston story, because believe me, I'm going to spend a lot of time finding more out about all of that. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Louise, did you want to, sorry, did you?
I've been wanting to say this for, the last 2 hours. I'm so, wow, what you've done with the archives. Thank you. I mean, it finishes or begins to finish a story for me. I was at the Bird collection maybe for 3 hours once, and they were all jumbled, and I just went through. But I asked Muriel, considering how she moved around so much and how Bill says she traveled light, how did she know to save all this? I asked her, and she said something I've got it in my notes. How did she know to save all this material? And you who have been scholars, how do you compare how she has saved her stuff the way others have? I mean, was she, you know, a 10 as far as saving materials that you can now, I mean, what would you say, Rowena?
I don't know. I've been stuck in her archive the whole time. So yeah, I guess she's a 10, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think she understood that I think she was very prescient, that she knew that her time would come. I mean, to me, I guess what made me understand that was that she left that rejection letter on top of Savage Coast. She knew that someone was going to see that and understand at some point the hypocrisy, the sex, whatever, all the things that rejection was compared to what the novel was. I mean, it was saved together. It was like a joke. It's like she knew the joke, and she knew that. So to me, that's how maybe Bill can speak to this, that she was someone who understood. But I also feel like some of it is probably random, the way all of our collections of stuff are in a way.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, partly it's just that like Virginia Woolf kept everything in diaries very nicely. So you could follow her through the archive in a certain kind of way, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But it still took the Herculean effort of feminist scholars to bring that material to light. And so I think in some ways, as I said in my talk, the condition of women's writing is these massive archives. And it's our job as scholars to continually go in them. I mean, Elaine Showalter has a whole thing about like taking a candle into the Woolf archives and like literally going to the basement of somewhere with a candle. And Rukeyser models it though, because her biographies do it too, right? She was a scholar. So yeah, I don't know. She's a 10 to me because I can't leave, but I'll let you know if I go to someone else's archive and find it neat and easy to live in.
Who organized those archives? Who did the organizing? How did you find what you found?
Well, the Berg one, the woman curator picked things. She went through, and that's how that one developed. Am I right with that, Bill? That she went and kind of just selected materials.
I don't know about how it was organized. What I can tell you is this, that as a biographer, in some cases a would-be biographer, very often an attacked biographer, my mother was very cognizant of the documentary evidence and documentary material. And so she had these big file cabinets. Dennis, you may have seen them at Westbeth. And they were pretty well organized. I went through them to a certain extent after her death. Some of her papers had already gone to both the Berg and the Library of Congress before, I think probably during the last decade of her life. One of my regrets is that all of it isn't in one place, either the Berg or the Library of Congress or somewhere else. But at least you've got two major troves within a few hundred miles of each other. And she impressed upon me, I think from an early age, not specifically with regard to her, but it wasn't hard to get the meaning of the message, the obligation of families, of public figures, to maintain the evidence, the documentary evidence, and to make it available and to cooperate with researchers. And also, despite the Boas experience, which didn't end with a book, she really kind of detested the idea of authorized biographies. And I think this was based on her experience, her bad experiences with the Gibbs family, that families had an obligation. They didn't have the right to second guess the researchers.
Yeah, and I know we have to go, but this is probably why Rukeyser's archive is so important, is that Bill is so generous with supporting us to go into the archive. It makes a huge difference, because I do have friends who work in other archives, and you can't even get letters. People won't even give you private letters or permission to use them. And it's crazy. And Bill is just supportive and generous and helpful, and it makes a huge difference, right?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you all. Trudy and Eleanor, thank you so much for your scholarship. And for everyone that was a part of this, thank you for your contribution and community around that scholarship and just bringing this to this discussion so fully to everyone watching and to us. That is why we are here, to celebrate the accomplishment, the work, and the life of Muriel. And so thank you. And as emerging scholars, as myself, and I know many who are watching, and Casey, we thank you for everything that done toward this. It makes our job a little easier, and it just it's so inspiring to see what is out there and what is still yet to come, and what we can do to bring that to light. Thank you. And to just remind you, our next panel starts at 2:30. And it's again it's very exciting pairing, Eric Keenahan and Adam Mitz. And then after that, we have yet another little panel, but this is a conversation with students and their responses. It's called Nourish Beginnings, and 4 of the students are from Eric Keenahan's class on Rukeyser at SUNY Albany, and one of them is from a class I taught last semester. So keep up your energy, get some coffee, eat something, and be back here. And thank you so much. I know we're going to go wild, Kaiser Scholars, is that we do share our archival finds.